Welcome to Module 11 of the Tribal Data Toolbox training, and in this module we are going to go over how to generate AQS formatted files from the Toolbox. So remember, in the previous module what we did was get the Toolbox ready to generate these AQS formatted files. So just so you know, there are two types of AQS formatted files that can be generated with the Toolbox. So the first type are the raw data files, and in AQS lingo this is called an RD file, and that includes the hourly plume or your MET parameter values that you collect. The second type of AQS formatted files are the QA/QC checks that you do, and in AQS lingo these are called QA files, and your QA files can include the results of your flow rate verifications if you're talking about PN data, or if you're talking about your gaseous pollutant data, that's the known versus measured checks. So after you generate these AQS format files with the Toolbox, you still need to complete the process of submitting these files to AQS. You need to log into AQS and then send the files on their happy way. So from within the Toolbox, to generate AQS files, we are going to start with the continuous or meteorological data fast track. And we use this button here that says AQS data file creation. So we click on that and we will see a new form, and here's how the form looks. So the way this form works is you want to select your options here on the left hand side and then move on to this right hand side of the form. I am going to start with my ozone data. You have to go from left to right and then from top to bottom. So you go across and then down, just like you're reading a book. So I need to start with my AQS site ID, and for my ozone monitor that's 0025, and my sampler ID is IN03. And my POC is 1. And now my parameters, I've got several different parameters here because my ozone monitor at this site, and I also have my meteorological monitor at this site. And remember, these are the codes that we assigned in the previous module. So all that work we did in the previous module is carried over here. So I'm going to start with the ozone. And the method code, we only entered one method code for ozone, right? So there's only one method here. So in all of the remaining boxes, there's only one option since we only entered one monitor protocol record for our ozone monitor. So the units, parts per million, which is what we want because that's what we entered, and the sample duration is 1 hour. So we made all the selections we need to make on the left-hand side of the form, and we're going to move on to the right-hand side of the form, which is starting up here. So the next thing we need to do is enter the range of the dates we want in our AQS submission file. So I've only imported 2 weeks of data for my ozone sampler into the Toolbox. So I only have a date range of August 8th, 2013 through August 22nd, 2013. And just remember, you can submit data to AQS on any schedule you want. So you can do a weekly submission, you can do a monthly submission, but most people do a quarterly submission. So if you were to do quarterly submissions, you would, for the third quarter, you would enter a date range of July 1st, 2013 through September 30th, 2013. So I'm just going to do my biweekly data, which was 8/8/2013 through 8/22/2013. And the next button that's on the form is the add zero value continuous pollutant records to AQS RD file for data gaps in this range. What this button does is allows the Toolbox to gap fill for missing date time values in the date range you selected. This is completely optional, but one of the advantages of doing this is that you are then reporting to AQS that you did have an active monitoring program during these missing hours, but for some reason the data are missing. So for example, your data logger had a power outage and it did not log that it was running during that period. So if you elect to use this ability, the Toolbox temporarily adds zero value records with an AQS null value code of AF. And AF means schedule but not collect in AQS. And then when you close the Toolbox AQS form, the Toolbox automatically removes the zero value records as added. It's not ever going to remove anything that you've added to the Toolbox, only the things that it adds. So it will just remove those zero values that it added. This is somewhat similar to what we saw on the Toolbox Continuous Method Reports and Charts form. But there is an important difference that I'm going to demonstrate. So remember that when I use this option from the Continuous Methods Reports and Charts form, the Toolbox did not find any gaps in my ozone data. So let's try it and see if it finds gaps here. Okay, so what's going on here? So why is it telling me that there's 24 pollutant records missing from the date range selected when it didn't said there was none missing when I did this button from the Continuous Methods and Report Chart? So the answer is that since you are submitting data to AQS from this form, the Toolbox assumes you have completed importing data for the start and end dates in the range you specified. So remember, my data set started at 8/8/2013, and it started at 8 a.m. and then it ended at 8/22/2013 at 7 a.m. So what the Toolbox does is counts the hours of 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. on 8/8/2013, as well as the hours of 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. on 8/22/2013 as missing. So that's where it's getting that total of 24 hours of missing data. So that data is not really missing because I still have more data to import into the Toolbox for August of 2013. So I do not want to use the gap filling method on this form, so I'm going to click cancel on that. If you want to use the gap filling option from the Toolbox from the AQS form, you need to make sure you have imported a complete day's worth of data for the starts and end times in the range you enter. So for example, if you wanted to submit data to AQS on a bi-weekly basis and your imports do not start at midnight on the first date or end at 11 p.m. on the last date, you would need to wait until after the next import into the Toolbox to generate the AQS data files for the first import, because then you would have the complete set. So if you choose to use the gap filling option. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel because I do not want to gap fill at this point. So we'll do that. And the AQS format type option here. So the Toolbox can output your AQS ready files in the type delimited format or the XML format. The default value for the box is pipe delimited. And you can choose XML from the drop-down box for your RD files, your raw data files, but you cannot choose XML for the quality assurance data, your QA files. It can generate pipe delimited for both of these. And I'm going to go on to the next step here. And the next step is the option of specifying AQS flags. Something important to note here is that AQS flags are the AQS exceptional events, the quality assurance, or informational flags. They are not, I repeat, not AQS null value code. In the Toolbox, you can only assign AQS null value codes in the final data validation step that we went over in Module 8. So assigning an AQS flag does not invalidate the data or prevent the data from appearing in the Toolbox reports. Adding an AQS flag only flags the data, but the value is still included in the AQS formatted file. So remember that the internal Toolbox flags that you assigned during the initial data review when you imported your data into the Toolbox are not shown in the AQS formatted files. And maybe this is something you want to do, so you want to add AQS flags to the Toolbox flag data you have not invalidated. That might be a time that you want to use AQS flags. But remember, they're completely optional. And for my ozone data, I do not have any values that I want to add an AQS flag to. So I'm not going to complete that step. And I'm going to move on and go into the raw data inspect data step. All of the steps for generating a raw data file are enclosed by this green frame here. So once I've told the Toolbox what kind of raw data I want, so I want ozone data, and I want the data for this range, I can generate that file with the Toolbox. So the first button allows me to inspect the data, so I'm going to click on that. And this is the report you get when you click on that button for your pollutant data. So besides making sure that this is the data that I intended to select, this is also an opportunity to make sure I assign the AQS null value codes and AQS flags that I wanted to assign. So you'll see right here that I assigned an AQS null value code and my concentration is nulled out. And that's also how it's going to appear in the AQS formatted file. This is not an AQS formatted file. This is just an inspection of the data before the AQS formatted file is generated by the Toolbox. Also, I wanted to note that there's 2 checks that the Toolbox performs here, and those checks are represented by the red and the orange headers. And if you see a value other than 0 in this box here that says number of concentrations exceeding EPA sampler data guidelines without AQS null value codes, then that means that the Toolbox has found concentrations that are either below the EPA absolute minimum or they're above the EPA absolute maximum for the sampler. And remember that you can research what the EPA absolute minimum is and the EPA absolute maximum is, and we have a link to research that in our notes document. And this is telling you, okay, you've not assigned an AQS null value code to these really small or really large concentration values, and those are going to go into your AQS formatted file that the Toolbox generates unless you take further actions. So if you have these values, we recommend that you invalidate them, because if they're above the absolute maximum or below the absolute minimum, those are really large or really small values, and they're more than likely something's wrong with your sampler. So that's something you should have caught in the final data validation step, but everyone's human and perhaps you need it, but we can catch it now and invalidate that data by going back to the final data validation step of the Toolbox. So I don't have any in my particular data set. If you had them, they would show up as a warning. You would see a warning for each of the rows that had that. And the next check it does is the number of concentrations exceeding 3 standard deviations from average with the AQS null value codes header. So that means that the Toolbox has found concentration values that are more than 3 standard deviations from the average concentration for that sampler. So what the Toolbox does is it calculates an average and a standard deviation that are specific to your data. So it goes through and it checks your data and says, wow, this value was above 3 standard deviations from the average, and it gives you a warning. And you would find those here as well, but they would be in orange. And these are not as important to invalidate. And in fact, you might not want to invalidate them if the Toolbox is just telling you that they're there. So notice this is in red, so this kind of goes like a stoplight, meaning red, stop. So if you saw red in here, you probably want to stop and go back to the final data validation step. So I don't have either of those that pertain to my data, because I have zeros in both ways. So I'm going to continue reviewing my data by scrolling through this report. So I just scroll. I remember that I also invalidated. So these were the other 2 that I invalidated, and you'll notice also that they are nulled. And then at the very bottom, there is an option to view the data in spreadsheet format if you want to look at your data in a query rather than a report format. So I'm okay with viewing the data in report format, so I'm not going to click on that button. But if you want to, you could do that. And then if you do that, you have the option, as with any query in Microsoft Access, of exporting the data into a spreadsheet if you want to do that. If you need help with that, please let your instructors know. Everything looks good to me, so I am going to scroll back up here and close my report and go on to the next step in the Toolbox. So the next step you can see here is create AQS-RD file. So what that does is it makes the raw data file that's an AQS ready file. So I am going to click on that. It opens up the screen to navigate to that folder. So that particular folder is on my desktop. And here it is. It's called AQS Imports. So I click on that, or double click on that folder to open it. And right now there's nothing in there, it's empty. And another important thing to notice here is the file name. So what the Toolbox does is it gives your AQS ready files a name that's very specific to the data set. So the first thing in the name is AQS-RD. So that means that it's a raw data file. And then it gives you the AQS site ID. So site ID 0025. And it gives you the parameters. So for ozone, that's 44201. And it also gives you the date range of your data in that particular data file. So August 8th through August 22nd. If you have some other naming convention you want to use, you don't have to use this, and you could change it here. But I'm going to go with the default naming convention because I think it tells me a lot about my files. So I'm going to leave that, and then I'm going to click on the Save button. And when I do that, it gives me a message box, and it tells me that the raw data file has been generated and can be found, and where it can be found on my computer. So here's where it can be found on my computer. So I say OK. And now I can click on the View AQS-RD File button. So when I click on this View button, it's going to open up that file and show me how it looks. So let's take a look at how it looks. So here is the Pipe Delimited AQS Ready file. And you'll see that the first row, there is a null value, and that's because I invalidated that first record. And you'll see there's no concentration value, but there is an AQS null value code. So I just scroll through the data, make sure it looks good. I don't see anything funny, so everything looks good here. So I can go ahead and close that file. And now that file is ready to submit to AQS. So that's the first Ozone raw data file. So now we'll move on and we'll do our quality assurance, quality control data, and we'll generate an AQS ready file for that as well. So the first thing you want to do for your QA/QC data is click on the type of assessment field. And this box will look familiar because this is the exact same box that was on your quality control form when you entered your QC data into the toolbox. So for gaseous pollutants, we have two options here. We have the 1-point quality control and the annual performance evaluation. So the 1-point QC is the known versus measured data that you do on your own with your own equipment. Your annual performance evaluation data is something that someone outside of your agency does with their equipment. So far, we only have ozone data. We've entered into the toolbox for 1-point quality control. We haven't entered any annual performance evaluation into the toolbox yet. So we're just going to click on 1-point quality control, and then we're going to look at our data. So we click on the Inspect Data button. And it gives me this message box, and this is just a message about co-located samplers. And this is about how to show co-located samplers as QC data in AQS. So I don't have any co-located data. So I just read this and say, OK. And then it brings up this screen where I can see my data. So I've got 3 data points, which represents the 3 QC checks I've entered so far into the toolbox. And I've got an actual value and an indicating value. So I've got a known value and a measured value. So that looks good. So I can close this screen by clicking on the lower X button. And then I click on the Create AQS QA File button. And again, this shows the folder that I'm going to save my files in. So since I've already told the toolbox once where I want to save this file, it automatically goes to that folder. So I don't need to navigate it to it again once I've done it once on this particular form. So the file name, notice it looks very similar to the file name for my raw data file. The only difference is instead of RD, it says QC here because this is now a 1-point QC check, but everything else, the site, the parameter, and the time period is the same. So that looks good to me, so I click Save. And it tells me where the file can be found, and I say OK. And now we can look at that file. So we view QA file. And here is how the data look in pipe delimited format for my 1-point QC checks. So if I had annual performance evaluation data, I would do this again for my annual performance evaluation, but since I haven't entered that data into the toolbox yet, I can move on to my PM 2.5 data.